Today we take up Spock's first command in the Galileo 7.
Compliance, the final frontier. Tom Fox is the voyager of trekking through compliance. His mission? To explore the original series and seek out and share what it can teach you about compliance. Here's your host, Tom Fox.
Episode 16, the Galileo 7, Start 8, 2821.5. As the Enterprise is on its way to New Paris on Marcus III, it encounters a strange natural phenomenon. Commissioner Ferris wants Kirk to hurry on to New Paris, but Kirk is under orders to study all quasars and quasar-like phenomena, and so stops the Enterprise in order to do so. Kirk launches the shuttlecraft Galileo with Spock, Scotty, Boma, Latimer, Gattiano, and Yeoman Mears aboard. The 24-foot shuttlecraft is pulled off course into the Murasaki 312 electromagnetical storm and crash lands on Tarsus II. It and its crew are in one piece, but the shuttlecraft is gravely damaged. As Spock puts it, "Picturesque descriptions will not mend broken circuits, Mr. Scott. I believe you have your work cut out for you." Tarsus II seems safe at first with an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, so Spock sends Latimer and Gaetano outside to scout the area. Meanwhile, Commissioner Ferris continues pressuring Kirk to leave the shuttle behind in order to get the needed medicine to the plague victims on New Paris, but Kirk continues the search until the last possible moment. In an act of desperation, Kirk sends out the shuttlecraft Columbus to search Tarsus II. On Tarsus II, Spock gets his first taste of command, much to the resentment of his crew. Spock sums up his views on command by stating, "I neither enjoy the idea of command, nor am I frightened by it. It simply exists." Scott determines that much of the fuel has been lost and that the shuttlecraft's weight must be reduced by 500 pounds if it is to achieve escape velocity. While scouting the area, Latimer and Gattiano enter a thick mist. They then hear a croaking noise and are shortly thereafter attacked by the planet's 10 to 12-foot ape-like inhabitants. Latimer is killed by a spear whose tip resembles a Folsom point, but Spock's archaeological knowledge just makes his crew even more resentful. Boma insists on a funeral for Latimer, but Spock remains inside the craft with Scott trying to fix it. Unfortunately, they lose the remaining fuel when a line breaks. The crew wants to attack the apes, but Spock does not wish to because it would unnecessarily take life. So he instructs them to fire on them to frighten them but not kill them. Spock orders Boma to help with the repairs, and Gattiano is left behind. Alone and terrified, his phaser is knocked away, and then he is mauled to death. Scotty proposes powering the shuttlecraft by draining energy from the phasers, which is all well and good, except that it is the crew's only remaining defense against the planet's inhabitants. Spock goes to investigate what became of Gattiano and carries his body back despite a rain of spears from the ape-like inhabitants. Arriving back safely, Spock is surprised that his logical decisions have resulted in 2 deaths and the antagonism of his crew. The crew retreats to the craft, which is then set upon by one of the inhabitants with a large rock. Spock comes up with the idea of draining the batteries to electrify the exterior of the ship, which grants them a temporary reprieve. Unbeknownst to the crew of the Galileo, Kirk beams down landing parties, but they are unable to discover anything. Lieutenant Kelowitz from Landing Party 2 reports 1 dead, 2 injured by the anthropod creatures, whose databases classify them as resembling creatures from Hansen's planet. Scotty manages to get the shuttlecraft off the ground after tarrying shortly to give Spock time to get on board after he is slightly injured. The Galileo's crew is saved when Spock jettisons and ignites the fuel to serve as a flare for the Enterprise. This gives them only a few minutes before re-entering the planet's atmosphere, but allows them to be seen and transported safely back to the Enterprise. Kirk needles Spock about his act of desperation, and Spock defends his action as logical considering all other alternatives have been exhausted. Fun fact, Leonard Nimoy struggled with his role of Spock in this episode in many of his scenes because he had to account for the absence of William Shatner, who of course was Captain Kirk. About training for emergencies, and I can think of no greater emergency than befell the city of Uvalde, Texas a couple of weeks ago when a shooter went into an elementary school. The police department had been trained on strategy and tactics as dictated by the state of Texas in response to an active shooter at an elementary school. And unfortunately, it looks like everyone did everything they were supposed to except the police department. And within the police department, I would say many of the policemen did what they were supposed to do, and the fault lies with the commander on site. The commander on site was the chief of police of the Uvalde Independent School District, and he had the smallest, least experienced force on site, yet he was the commander due to the eccentricity of the way jurisdictional disputes over handling those types of situations are handled in the state of Texas. You have to practice. And I think what this means for a compliance officer is you have to mentor your compliance staff so that if they do have to step up in a leadership role, whether it's in the crisis of Uvalde or in the crisis that Spock faced with the crash of the Galileo 7, that he understands what's required of him of leadership. And sometimes you have to let your crewmen bury their dead crewmen as a sign of a respect going forward. Next up, compliance takeaway. There are multiple compliance and leadership lessons from this episode, and there's, I think, a pretty good discussion on ethical and regulatory standards in high-stakes, high-pressure situations. One of the key compliance takeaways from this episode is the clear importance of effective communication and coordination both within an organization and with external stakeholders. When the Galileo shuttlecraft is forced to make an emergency landing on the hostile planet, a breakdown in communications between the stranded away team and the Enterprise severely hampers their ability to navigate the crisis. This scenario underscores the need for compliance programs to establish robust and redundant communications channels, as well as clear escalation principles. Compliance leaders must ensure that all relevant parties have access to timely, accurate information, and the decision-making authority is well-defined, especially during times of duress. Another key lesson from the Galileo 7 is the challenge of maintaining ethical standards and adherence to policies and procedures when facing pressure and resource constraints. As the away team's situation becomes increasingly dire, the temptation to compromise their principles grows stronger. This mirrors the difficult choices that compliance professionals often face when balancing business imperatives against regulatory requirements. The Galileo 7 highlights the importance of embedding ethical decision-making into the core of your company's compliance framework, rather than treating it as a separate ad hoc consideration. Compliance professionals must work to instill a sense of shared responsibility and commitment to principled behavior at all levels of an organization. The Galileo 7 underscores the need for a rigorous risk assessment, contingency planning, and the cultivation of organizational resilience. The away team's inability to anticipate and prepare for the unexpected obstacles they encounter on the planet mirrors the types of unpredictable scenarios or risk that compliance programs must be ready to navigate. Effective compliance management requires a proactive, comprehensive approach to identifying, mitigating, and managing risk. Compliance leaders must work closely with cross-functional teams to develop and regularly test crisis response protocols, ensuring that the organization is fully equipped to respond quickly and effectively to compliance breaches or other disruptive events. Finally, the episode's portrayal of the conflict between the logical, rule-based approach of Mr. Spock and the more intuitive, emotionally driven decision-making of Commander Limley serves as a reminder for the need of compliance programs to balance structure and flexibility. While clear policies and procedures are essential, compliance leaders must also foster an environment that encourages critical thinking, constructive dissent, and a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances.
If you enjoyed this episode of Trekking Through Compliance, you can help it grow by sharing it with the biggest Trek fan you know.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.